so. Just to begin, good morning and thank you for joining our first webinar. My name is Allison and I'm the coordinator of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Mentorship Network. And we're co-hosting this webinar series with the Mentorship Network and the new Saskatchewan NEAR Center. And we have two more webinars lined up in the coming weeks, and both of those, the information is available on our website. Everyone on the call, I'm probably going to mute throughout the presentation just to kind of control background noise, and then we'll unmute following to open it up for questions. Also, if you have questions during the talk, you can type them into the chat and I can ask them at that time as well. So I want to start by introducing Dr. Tate. Dr. Caroline Tate is a University of Saskatchewan medical anthropologist and member of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan. Her particular research interests are Indigenous health and social justice, and she's a faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Tate and her team were recently awarded a $1.5 million CIHR grant to lead the national center that will coordinate health research and training with leads of the 8 other regional Indigenous health research networks. This team was also awarded a $3.5 million grant from CIHR over 5 years for the Saskatchewan NEAR Network, which will foster health research with Indigenous communities working in partnership with the FSIN, MNS, Whitecap Dakota First Nation, and a team of more than 60 researchers and community partners. Needless to say, Dr. Tate is well practiced in the art of putting together grants, both large and small. Thanks to Dr. Tate for facilitating our inaugural webinar. And also, just before I pass it over, both Rhonda and Fleur from our team are on the call as well, and they both have lots of experience in terms of putting these kinds of projects together. So thank you to everybody for joining us, and go ahead, Caroline.
Yeah, so I think we can move to the second slide, which is a picture of our team, and just so that folks can see who our core team is at the moment, and we're the team that put together the grants for the NEARS. And so if you can go to the next slide, please. So putting together a grant application, a successful grant application, is really a skill that is different than other types of writing skills that we have as researchers. And that is that in order to write a successful grant, there's a number of key components that we don't always talk about. And I will talk about those, and that's including your budget and your logic models and other things like that. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it is, I want to say, a skill, and one that everybody should practice if you're an academic, and particularly around writing grants that involve First Nations and Métis and Inuit people. That this is also, it's not only the grant writing, but it's also how you formulate your team. So I'm going to start with this is a very pragmatic, practical presentation on the things that I do and others to build our grants and to be successful as a grant writer. And so the first thing that I do is to identify funding opportunities. And so I do this on a regular basis, where I will sit down and, every couple of weeks, I'll go through a number of websites of funders and look to see what new funding opportunities have come out and whether those funding opportunities align with the communications, the discussions that I'm having with the Indigenous partners that I'm working with. Every once in a while, a funding opportunity will come up that I know that my partners that I'm working with, or people, communities that I want to work with, may not have considered. And so I often take to them ideas and say, there's this funding opportunity. Do you think you would like to do something that would align with it? Is there something that you feel would work? And so it's a constant back and forth with First Nations and Métis communities here in Saskatchewan that I have. And then I do have, on a regular basis, First Nations and Métis communities coming to me and saying, this is something that we're really interested in doing some research on. Could you find a research opportunity, a funding opportunity? And then I go through all of the the opportunities that I can find to see if I can align their interests. And so that's a big part, a really important part of my job and the job of researchers who work with our communities is trying to align those positions. And we're going to have one thing that we're going to have with our new research center, our community research facilitators, and we believe that this is incredibly important. And these are individuals that will drive, they'll get in their cars and they'll drive to our First Nations and Métis communities. And so whether it's urban, rural, remote, people will be going to those communities and talking to the leaders, the health leaders there, and their groups to find out what are the research priorities of our First Nations and Métis communities in the province, and we'll be matching them with researchers. So as time goes on, there'll be this additional support to our research and Indigenous community partners to facilitate research. And so one of the things that you need to do is you need to decide on which of the funding opportunities make sense for the area that you want to research with the community partners. And are you in a position in your career to apply for that funding opportunity? So when I say that there are, as new investigators should be looking for new investigator calls first and foremost. So as a new investigator, which is basically defined in it's the first 10 years of your academic appointment, that you can go into competitions where you're in competitions with people who are within that first 10 years. So what it does is it gives you a smaller pool of people that you're competing against, smaller team, in terms of leaders. So these would be the nominated principal investigators would be in the first 10 years of and so you're in a different field of competition, and that can be very different than if you're going into a larger pool, which is the project grants, for instance, with CIHR, or the New Frontiers grants, which we have been involved with, where you will have people who are in the senior researchers, senior teams that have had high levels of success over the years. And so you're much better off to be competing in a new investigator pool than competing in a more competitive pool. However, you should always swing for the fence. So there's no reason that a new investigator can't go after some of those other funds. So you just have to weigh a number of different things that I'll talk about in terms of can you put together a successful grant or not. So that's important. And then as a new investigator, one of the things that new investigators really need to pay attention to is that in the early stages of your academic appointment, in the first 2 years, you should have at least applied for one tri-agency grant. So if anyone is telling you that you should be looking at other sources of funding because you're not ready as a new investigator, and that you would do this later on in your career, that's not good advice. The best advice as a new investigator is to swing for the fence right away. And when I started at the University of Saskatchewan in 2004, Dr. Bruce Waygood, who was a mentor of mine, became a mentor of mine, said to me, I want to see you with a new investigator grant in your first 2 years. And I assumed that was good advice, and was successful in obtaining a CIHR grant as a new investigator. If I had waited and not applied, and not applied for 2 or 3 years, then I may not have been as successful. And so that was really, really good advice. And I encourage people to follow that advice. And so can we just go to the next slide, please? So putting together your research team is one of the most important things that you can do. And your research team involves a number of different people, and it will involve people from your community, the partners that you have. So either if you're partnering with a Friendship Center, for instance, it might be the executive director of the Friendship Center, and some of the people that work there would be on the grant. If it's First Nations Reserve community, it may be the health director. And some of the staff that work would be partners. Elders can be involved in your grant. If you're talking about a large scale, say, uh, survey in Saskatchewan that's looking at a health indicator or looking at health indicators, you would partner with FSIN and Kyle Pretty Shield and the people in his group and the vice chief of health, or you would partner with Métis Nation. And so you really have to decide on who your community partners are, depending on the scope of your research and the methodology. And so you may have multiple partners, multiple community partners, but you may have a conversation with, say, a health director in a First Nations reserve that says we want to study um, uh, maternal health. And then you may go to, with the support of your community partners, you may approach 2 or 3 other communities and bring more partners into the mix. And so designing or pulling together your research team means doing a lot of work up front with your community partners to determine who should be part of the research team. Other people who should be on your grant, of course, is you need to include senior researchers. If you're a junior researcher, a new investigator, it's really important to have at least one senior researcher who's in a position to mentor you if you have your first grant, or if it's one of your first grants. It's always beneficial to have that person there to support you and to give you guidance along the way. And generally, it's somebody that you've worked with in other capacities that you trust, and someone that you feel will bring added an added benefit in terms of their experience with research methodologies and other things. If you're a senior researcher, you should be looking at absolutely bringing on at least 1 or 2 or more new investigators and postdocs. And that's really important because as new investigators are building their careers, it's highly, highly important that senior researchers bring on new investigators and mentor them in terms of grant writing and administration of grants. So that's incredibly important. The other thing is to bring on other knowledge users. So this can be people from for instance, in Saskatchewan, the Saskatchewan Health Authority. It can be the people, for instance, the Northern Tribal Health Authority, other stakeholders that are looking at policy and developing policy for in the area that you're doing research. So there can be a number of partners. And I always say to people when I talk about the grants that I've done, I try to make sure that I have um, I don't know how to say this exactly, but basically, I have no problem being the dumbest person on my grant. I love to have people who are innovative and creative and who I look up to and who are much better at this than I am, because the stronger your research team can be, the better. So the last thing an NPI needs, a nominated principal investigator, the last thing you should be is somebody who feels threatened by the people on your team. It's like you're much better to pull together the most skilled and creative people that you possibly can. And this is really, really important because that will help when the reviewers look. They will be looking at who are you partnered with and where are you going to get that strength as a team? Where does the strength come from? So you want to identify people as well that are going to make a contribution. So you don't want people on your grant that are just going to disappear and not attend meetings and not be active on your grant. So you have to create opportunities for people on your grant to be active participants, and then you have to ask them for a commitment that they will be active participants in the grant, right? So there will be people who will be working with you much closer than others. So there may be some people that all they do is just show up at meetings and they give input and they give guidance and they give mentorship, and that's okay. And then there may be other people on your team that will be collecting data alongside of you, working directly in the analysis of the data with the community partners and that. So your team is to really look at the different roles of your team. We include in all of our grants now we work with a man by the name of Michael Heimlich, and Michael does evaluation and helps us put together a number of things for our grants. So depending on the size of the grant, you have to look at issues of governance, and certainly in your grants, you'll be looking at how is the data going to be managed and governed. You have to look at community research agreements and other things. So there's going to be a number of activities that you are going to have to describe in your grant of things that you're going to do that facilitate the relationship between you and your community partners. You also have to put together a work plan, right? And so I'll talk about that a little bit more. So having key people working with you on your grant, and at the time that you're putting together your team, please do not forget your administrative staff. So in order to put together a successful research grant, there are a number of different components, and we're going to talk about those. You have to think about and the skill set that you need to support you to do that. So it's just not putting together a really strong, say, 10-page proposal. It's really about putting together that along with your budget, along with your governance structure, and along with your logic model and other supporting documentation. So again, moving on with your research team, students are incredibly important, opportunities for training of students. And students, in terms of their own research, so you can build within to your grant opportunities for students to do their own research. And from the Indigenous Mentorship Network, there is support there if you're a researcher to find out more about how to include students, to identify students who you could name in your grant that could potentially work on your grant. And so student opportunities and training is generally favored within a review process. So if I'm a reviewer on a CIHR grant, one of the things that I'm looking for is, are they going to be training the next generation? Where are the training opportunities for postdocs? Where are the training opportunities for students? So it's important for you to look at that. And we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. The role of elders. And so through your community partners, if you are going to include elders in your grant, you have to, if you don't already know, you have to learn what are the protocols for inviting elders to participate. And elders consistently have said to our team and to other teams that they don't want to just be window dressing. They don't want to be people who are just asked to come and say a prayer whenever the team meets, but they want active participation. And the value within First Nations and Métis communities is that our elders have enormous amount of knowledge and mentorship that they can provide to any research team. So this may mean for some of our elders, you will need to have translation. So if you're working with some of our northern elders who speak Dene as their first language, you're going to have to look at how are you going to include them, and do you have ways of communicating with them through translation and other means of having translators. And these are things that you want to consider putting into your budget, right? Is how are you going to do that so that everybody from the community that's involved in your grant can participate in a meaningful way, right? Postdoctoral fellows are important. Recruiting postdoctoral fellows, you need to have a salary to provide to them. So that's part of your budget is of course their base salary, as well as the role that they will play. And again, this is a mentorship role, and postdoctoral training is so important as we move into what I believe in the next few years is going to be extremely difficult times for universities to hire people. And so postdocs, we're going to have more people who are coming out of PhDs, that the postdoctoral opportunity is the opportunity that will be available to them when there aren't faculty appointments. So we need to really take seriously about building in postdoctoral opportunities whenever we can, so that we can provide jobs for people with PhDs who are waiting to get into a faculty position. So that's really, really important. And then postdoctoral fellows, I will add, are people who really can give you so much because they're at the cutting edge. So our young people who are doing their doctoral, they're writing their doctoral thesis and who are doing their research, they're actively participating in research and are some of the most creative, important people to have on your grant. And so I'll say, do not be shy about sharing what your ideas are and asking people to be part of your team and building your team so that you have the level of commitment that you want, and that this is about having a relationship with your team members, whether it's community partners, or whether it is other people who are coming from the research community. But this is generally a 3 to 5 year commitment to one another. And so you have to think about that commitment, and don't be shy to ask people who you feel have expertise. And even if you feel that that person is too busy and they may not have time to participate, you can talk to them about that and let them make the decision. And people generally say if they're too busy, they will say, or they may say, I can play a reduced role on your grant. I will make a commitment to come to all the meetings. I will make a commitment to give my input, but I won't be available to do things like data collection and analysis. So you need to make decisions around that and around what is the best configuration of your team. And what a lot of people do is they work with partners so that you may have 2 or 3 people that will consistently be on each other's grants. And so at one time, one person will be the nominated PI, and another time, another person will be. And many of us have done that for a number of years with different configurations of teams. And it works really well, and because you have that continuity within your team. So at the next slide, if we could go to the next slide. So the question of how long does it take to write a successful grant proposal is probably the question that should be, it is the question that should be asked every time you embark upon a grant writing process. But it's one that I have seen over the years, and I have learned my lesson a long time ago, that if you cannot write a competitive grant in a month, it's very rare unless you have stuff that's already written, and unless it is a call where there isn't a lot of competition. But if you're talking about our tri-agencies and you're talking about doing authentic uh, engagement with First Nations and Métis and Inuit people, then you need to start right when the call comes out, if not sooner. So for instance, we know that we assume, that there'll be project grants for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research in the fall of 2020. So already we are talking and have talked about what kind of a project grant could we put in. So there's certain calls that are predictable every year, that you have the predictability. You know that there's going to be these general operating calls that come out, and you can plan for those well in advance of the actual call being posted by the funder. And then there's other calls, and generally you have somewhere between 4 to 6 months to write your application, particularly if it's a larger grant. And then they of course they're tiered in some ways, where you can have just an expression of interest, which means you basically register and you don't have to really put anything in, but you're registered. Then the next phase would be a letter of intent, of which you do compete. And so a letter of intent gets you past that first stage, and it's a really, really important stage. Now, there are times when the letter of intent, if you're not successful, you can still submit a full proposal, but you don't get the development money. And we had that with our networks of environments of Indigenous health. So with these research centers, we were given at the letter of intent stage $75,000, but other teams who wanted to apply for the full proposal were open to apply. They just didn't get the letter of intent money with the 75,000, but it still was not a closed competition at the full proposal stage. There's other calls where if you don't get past the letter of intent stage, you're not invited to put a full proposal in. So the letters of intent are very, very important, and that gets you into a smaller pool of people And then generally in that smaller pool, your success rate goes up. So it might be 20% at the letter of intent stage, but once you get past that stage, it may go up to 30, 40, 50% that you would be successful. So it's really important to pay attention to the letter of intent. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So for student funding, it's a little bit different. So students generally don't put together teams of people, and your proposal is about your doctoral research or your master's level research. And sometimes these are reviewed internally through the university and then advanced through your institutions. And so I have seen this with students as well as faculty, of people just underestimating the amount of time it takes to put together things that are required by the application. So for instance, people may spend a significant amount of time putting together their research proposal, their 10-page proposal, but not very much time on receiving letters of support, and making sure that those come in, putting together their logic model, their work plan, and other documents that go into grant applications that are really important. Budget is extremely important. So the budget, generally, I think at the review stage, people take a look at the budget and they consider it, and they look for anything that looks like it's out of place or that isn't fundable. They're looking to say, okay, the amount of work that they're doing, does that reflect the amount of money they're going to spend on research assistance, on travel, other things like that. And so the budgets are scrutinized, but if you have a strong proposal and you have a reasonable budget, then the budget is not such a big deal. If you have a budget that looks completely out of whack, so if you ask for too much money, you can have your budget reduced. So one of the things you want to do is make sure that the activities that you are describing in your proposal align with your budget. And so all of this takes time, and you need to be able to have the time to align those well. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, and so the question of competition, I've talked a little bit about competition and tri-agency funding, and so in my opinion, there should be an expectation of all people who take faculty positions to enter into applying for tri-agency funding. And so I'll say in the health sciences, for instance, so in the health sciences and Indigenous research, people who are working with our communities, we highly, highly encourage people to apply for tri-agency fundings, which are the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, and the national, I can't remember the other one, NSERC, which is more in line of engineering and that. We don't in Indigenous health go after NSERC money so much. It's usually CIHR money and SHRC money, and then in Saskatchewan, SHRF, which is the Saskatchewan Health Research Foundation. But the reason the university wants you to go after this money, your university, is because there are indirect costs that come to the university, which are quite, I don't know the percentage, but it's another pocket of money, another basket of money that comes to the university when a researcher receives tri-agency funding that helps the university with infrastructure and other operating costs so that you can do your research. And so when we look at tri-agency funding, though, we know that it's highly competitive. And I've been in calls where there's an estimate like the success rate was around 16%. So the success rate is low. So the question is, how do you make sure that that you're able to be in that 16% of successful grants? And that's where you want to pay attention to all of the details that are being asked in the research proposal. And that includes with these other documents, such as your budget, and that every little detail is important, that because generally reviewers are scoring, and when they're scoring, the scores are quite close, can be quite close together. So you may have a fundable grant, but they don't have enough money to fund you. So just because you have a grant that's fundable doesn't mean that there'll be enough money to go around. So you want to make sure that when you submit something, it is as polished and as precise as it possibly can be. And this is really where, back to time, that's why you need the amount of time that you need, that you cannot put it off and just whip it together within a month or so. You need to really look at a lot of planning and rewriting redrafting your grant and having people look at it. As a reviewer, I've reviewed several times with CIHR in different capacities, and with the Sask Health Research Foundation and other granting agencies. And excuse me, when it comes to Indigenous health research, one of the things that I think all of us look for, and it's required by the tri-agency guidelines, and the chapter on research with Indigenous peoples, is we want to see authentic community partnerships. And those authentic community partnerships, it's not always easy to tell whether they exist or not with a team of people, but the ways in which we look at them to determine if those partnerships exist, and not that the researcher has just managed to get a letter from a community partner that they haven't talked to very much, that isn't involved in the project all that much. So what we look at is we look at the number of times that the researchers have met with the community partners. So you should be documenting all of your meetings, including meetings prior to even when the research call comes out. So documentation of how long have you been working with this partner? How did you identify this as being a priority for the community partners? And then as you started to build the proposal, how much, like having those conversations. So when you're having meetings and when you're building your proposal, you should be having regular meetings with your community partners and working with, of course, with their schedule to make sure, because our communities are extremely busy and research always isn't the priority for them. So I encourage you to do that. And then also the letters of support is that we commonly will draft a letter of support, but then we'll ask our community partners to go over it and add in what they want to add into it, and make it their own letter of support. So letters of support are really important. And just the reviewers want to see where the communities are involved in the design of the study and the activities. How are they going to be involved in data analysis? What is the governance structure? How is the data going to be governed? All of those questions are important questions that a reviewer will be looking at. And you want to show that you've thought about those questions, because this will help to set you up, set your team up as a successful team, as if you can show that. So can we go to the next slide? So where do you find out about research opportunities? And I'll go over this quickly, that there's lots of ways to find out about research opportunities, including going to the various websites of the funders, the tri-agency funders, looking at research listservs. USask has a research listserv that you can look at. And you can uh, uh, search different opportunities. And one of the things that our centers will be doing, so the National Coordinating Center and the Saskatchewan Center, is that we will have an ongoing list of research opportunities, and we will send those out in our newsletters and other ways. If you're not sure whether or not it's a funding opportunity that fits with what you're doing, I would really suggest getting a hold of us, and we can go over it with you and help you decide if it is a good match. Our center is there to support you, including we can provide letters of support to you as a team. So we'll go on to the next slide. And these are just some basic nuts and bolts about what you need to know if you have not applied for a call yet. That you will do your research proposal in a word processor and then upload it onto the site. You have to remember things that can take time are your references, is to make sure that as you're writing your proposal, you keep track of your references and that you're able to have them at hand in terms of diagrams, logic model. Logic models are incredibly important. And as a reviewer, I love when somebody has a logic model so I can look at the different activities, when they're going to do them, why they're doing them, what is the outcome that they expect, who's in charge of that particular activity. That's very, very important because then I can see as a reviewer, I think, okay, this team is ready to hit the ground running. They have an idea. They have a very clear idea of how they're going to start the process, how the process will unfold, who's responsible for that process, and what is the outcome of it. Also, your governance models that, and this is will be required by your community partners, those partners who know about research and are following the guidelines. So if they're following the First Nations OCAP guidelines, or if they're following, in Saskatchewan now we have the Métis data governance, if they're following those, then you should incorporate into your grant, and you should do this anyway, you should incorporate into your grant, how is data going to be managed? How is the research, what is the research governance? What is the governance of this project? And do you have an advisory committee that may be made up of Indigenous stakeholders that aren't there in the everyday work of data collection and that, but are groups that you, or a group that you meet with maybe you meet with them quarterly, right? And so your community partners will direct you in terms of what that governance model, what are they comfortable with, how do they want this. It in some ways, with some of our partners over the years, that I've found that they want to be involved in those quarterly meetings, and they just want you and your team to go ahead and do the data collection, and they will meet with you at the quarterly meetings. Other communities I have worked with, they want to be every day involved in the project. So everything right from data collection, data analysis, everything, that it is an activity that everybody does together. So that's really important that you determine that, and in terms of how is the project going to move forward, and that your budget, you need to look at what's eligible. So the key part of writing your proposal is to look at what you can and cannot do with the money that you have, right? So you need to know what can be funded, what can't be funded, and then you need to justify. So the justification is usually a paragraph in terms of why do you need to hire this research assistant? Why do you need to travel to these, why do you need the travel budget you need in that? So you need to make those justifications, and you need to pay attention in terms of equipment and other things like that that you can buy. And so there's certain guidelines around buying equipment. So for any of us that are working that around community-based research and that generally need computers and things like that, that's not such a big problem that you can build that into your grant. But once you get into having larger amounts of equipment and a larger equipment budget, then you need to really look at that and to see whether or not the grant will accommodate that budget. And that's very, very important. So also the CVs for team members, collecting CVs from people can be quite intense, and especially if you're collecting from community partners who may not be registered. So they may have to register with CIHR, they may have to register with the with other agencies. And so we're having that standardized more and more, that there's one portal for which the common CV and research net. So that has become a lot easier than it used to be. But people will need to have a number, a CV number, and a password. So there's things that need to be done. This is where, if you at all have an administrative team that can support you, this is where I highly, highly rely on my team to do this work for me. And so people who know about this are valuable, valuable people. With our new NEAR Center in Saskatchewan, we will be helping teams with this type of work. So we do have capacity, and we don't know whether we're going to have too many people asking for this support. But at the moment, we're saying to people, if you need help with putting your budget together, if you need help with collecting people's CVs and getting community people registered, and that we will be able to help with the common CV system and to help that. Letters of support are really, really important. So for students, you want to be looking at getting letters of support from your supervisor, maybe from your department head, and other types of support letters. For if you're working with organizations, one of the things that we have found over the year working with our community partners, whether it's a community or whether it's an something like the Friendship Center, and that is that you want to try to not place burden upon them, because generally, you know, they're overemployed. Most of the people who you're working with are working long hours, and so you want to be able to help them by drafting the letter, you know, and asking them again to redraft it, add in what they feel should be in it, and that. But that really helps with the letters of support, is for you to give them that support. So you don't want to say to a community partner, please, you know, here's the 10-page proposal, you know, can you write a letter of support? And there's very few of our community partners that are going to say, oh yes, absolutely, I'll get it to you right away. Most of them look at it as, oh my gosh, when am I going to do this? I have so many other things on my plate. And so one of the ways you can help them is by drafting that letter, and giving them a brief summary of what's in the proposal and that. So, and this will again depend on how involved the partners are in different aspects of the research design. And I've had some, as I said, partners that are there, you know, reading drafts and going over and providing feedback. And then I've had other community partners that say, you know, Caroline, that's your job. We trust you to put together. So please just give us updates. And so through the writing process, I provide them with updates, and we have a level of trust that they trust that I know what I'm doing, and they expect me to do that job as the research lead. And so it really depends, and that's why building those trusting relationships are so incredibly important. Signature pages and your university timeline, the timeline of your institution, is very important to know when your institution needs for this to happen, right? And so sometimes you can push it a bit, those deadlines, and we have amazing people at the University of Saskatchewan who have been very accommodating for us. But I don't recommend that you push that, because they're under enormous amount of pressure. So the sooner you can get a draft of your proposal into the system and get those signatures, the better it is for everybody. Can we go to the next slide, please? And these are just, again, nuts and bolts that you know, to get started on your application, you need to read the full call, and you need to read it. You need to highlight in it what's important. You need to make sure that you are extremely familiar with what is being asked in the application. And then, you know, you'll start to, there's an online system, so start to look at the online system and what are the things that you can start to populate on that system that can be saved as you go through. So you could doing some of that, but you need to constantly refer back to what is the research call asking you to do, and you should never deviate from what it's asking you to do, because as researchers, when we see people deviating from that, it's not a proposal, because we're looking at the proposal, the RFA, and we're saying, okay, this is what we're supposed to be evaluating. Are all these components there? Are they answering the questions that the RFA, you know, that the research call had asked them to answer? And so it's very important that you pay attention and not deviate from that. And the letters, again, we've gone over the CVs, that this is on the common CVs. If you're using, for most agencies, provincial and federal, you would use the common CV now. Although some private foundations and that, they may not require this, they may not be using this, and they may ask you for a CV that's in a different format. But a lot of the time, what you can do is you can just use your common CV and download it, because it is a comprehensive CV, and you can download a PDF of it and use that for funding. So it's really important as a researcher that you update your common CV on a regular basis. So you should be updating it, if not once a month, you should be updating it at least quarterly. And that's really important because the last thing you want is to have a research deadline and then realize you've written a brilliant proposal, but your CV is a mess, and you haven't updated it in 2 or 3 years or something like that. So it's really important that you keep your CV updated. And again, when you're looking at people who you're hiring and you're looking at research assistants, that can be a task that you can task somebody with to do on a regular basis. And again, I've gone to the next slide, writing the research proposal, and I've talked quite a bit about that already, that you want to look at what are the different components of the application, what are they asking you to do, and what is the evaluation criteria for the proposal. So I often in my proposals will use as headings, the thing that they're looking for. So if it's involvement of Indigenous people, I will have that as a heading, and then I will describe, how my community partners, our community partners on the team, are involved in the project. Or if it's asking you about the research environment, then you would have research environment, and you would describe the environment at your institution, but then also the research environment at a community level. How are you going to create a strong research environment, so that your community partners are involved? So that's really, really important. And we'll go to the next slide. Don't be shy about having people read your proposal, even if it's not in the best shape, but you feel that you need feedback. So go to people, your team members. You can ask your team members to write sections of the proposal. If you're a student, you can ask your supervisor to review your proposal. We have research facilitators at the University of Saskatchewan. We have research facilitators. Take advantage of those. Those are in your colleges and in some departments. Research services. If you have questions about your budget or have questions pertaining to the call, that often research services can weigh in on certain things, and have a group of people, ask them in advance and say, could you take a couple hours to read over our proposal? Would you mind doing that? Internal reviews are highly, highly important, and those are offered by the university and will be set up by the university. And internal reviews, and in many cases now with universities, they're requiring internal reviews as part of the application process, so that they don't want to advance teams. They can't stop you, but they would prefer not to advance teams that haven't gone through an internal review. So I don't commonly go through an internal review at this point in my career, because I have written several successful grants, and often time-wise, it just doesn't fit with my timeline. However, when I have gone through internal reviews, they have been really beneficial. And so they are important, and in particular for new investigators and people starting out their career. And I know I had Sylvia Abney, who's an amazing researcher, who reviewed my first proposal. And then she was kind enough to give me a copy of a successful proposal that she had written. And I looked at the way that she had put it together, and I remember one of the key things I pulled out from her proposal was to have a separate work plan, and to do a table with a work plan and a schedule. And I put that into my grant. And I believe that was one of the main reasons that my grant was funded, is that I was ready. I had mapped it out, and it really helped me in terms of writing and realizing, okay, so this is how the grant is going to unfold, that this is going to happen in month 1. And I went from month 1 to in that case, month 36, of outlining how are we going to do this proposal. So really draw upon, look at other proposals that people have written, and I think the universities are sharing, that other researchers have shared, and you can look at those, look at people's budgets, look at all aspects of the proposal, and you can call us or email us at any time to get support from our team, and we will support you. Next slide, please. And again, as I said, I've talked a little bit about this to make sure that you give yourself enough time to get those signatures. One of the most stressful times for a research team is just before submission. And you can get those research signatures if you have a draft of your proposal. So you can keep working on your proposal. But as long as you have a draft that shows basically what you're doing, the universities will read that and give you feedback and that. So this is very, very important, that you can keep writing till you're ready to submit to the day of submission, but the university will require a draft of that ahead of time so that they can do the signatures. And if you go to the next slide, this is for the University of Saskatchewan, and it gives you the required signatures and university approval. So I can leave that for you to look at it another time. And so the last slide is just some very, very good advice. And that's that you need to start early, and it takes time. It takes an enormous amount of time, and you will have to probably put other things aside to put your full attention into a research proposal. And one of the reasons it takes time is because you are doing other things, right? So the rest of your life just doesn't stop. If we had 2 months and we were only writing a research proposal, you might be able to do it in 2 months, but generally people are teaching, you're doing your research in communities, you need time. You have to make sure that the communities have enough time so that things come up in communities where it's not always easy to meet the people who you need to meet and to go over things. And so certain times of the year, like around the holidays, around summertime, that it's a little bit more difficult to engage communities. If you're engaging more than one community partner, then that means that you're traveling to multiple sites, or you're bringing people together and you need to accommodate their schedule. So time is something to take extremely, extremely seriously. And if you can start sooner than later, that's always the best rule of thumb. So, and I think that's it. So I don't know that there's any, I think that's my last slide. So I will, if there's any questions, I'll open it up to questions. And we have a bit of time for questions.
Just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. And I'll also say, with regards to the Canadian Common CV, the little image on that slide is actually from our website, and University of Victoria has put together an intro to the Canadian Common CV that you can go and flip through their slides, and it's kind of a step-by-step process on how to set that up for yourself. And so that's pretty handy, and you can access it through their website or through the Mentorship Network website as well.
Hi, this is Fleur. I think it's Allison talking about the Common CV is a useful time to mention that there's like many, many, many resources online. Over time, we'll probably curate a bunch of them on our website as we get our research center more established. But in the meantime, if you're having trouble finding resources or figuring out, how to do some of these things, certainly reach out to us at our research network, and we can provide support around that. And there's just a lot out there that you can learn from, and I think that we can be of a lot of help there. This is quite a quiet bunch this morning, but I'm wondering if maybe people that are on the line have joined us today maybe could introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their research interests.
Okay, so so maybe we can wrap it up then if there's no questions.
So I do know, Caroline, that Eric had to step away, but he's coming back shortly, and I know he has questions because he had sent me some comments around them.
Okay, yeah.
I think he'll be back in soon.
So maybe I'll talk a little bit then, and if there's questions, please interrupt me. But maybe I'll talk a little bit about partnering with Métis Nation and FSIN and some of our larger organizations, and the importance of time in relation to them. So unlike a community partner like a First Nation reserve, for instance, or a Métis community partner, or a partner like the Friendship Center, and that if there's a research call and you see the call and you think, oh, we've been talking about this, this is good, we can go ahead and maybe have a conversation, that the process of having a research project approved, and so that you can go forward and they can be partners, can be relatively short. So in some cases, I've had health directors that have said, yes, absolutely, we're partnered with you. And however, when it comes to our larger partners, that they have board of directors, or they have, in the case of FSIN, they have the Senior Technical Advisory Group. And so they have a process that they have to go through and follow when it comes to partnering with outside partners. And so if you plan to go to them, one of the things you should do at the very beginning is to get a hold of the people who are in charge of health and ask them, what do I need to do to establish a partnership for this research call? And is there enough time to do so? Because sometimes there just simply isn't enough time, depending on when the Senior Technical Advisory Group is meeting, for instance, and whether you can get on the agenda. Before you do that, before you would say, take an idea to FSIN, then you need to find out what the schedule is. You need to talk to, in this case, Kyle Predeshield and his team, as to whether or not they think that this is something that should go to the Senior Technical Advisory Group. And so within research, there's a lot of discussion with Indigenous communities that the Indigenous communities should drive the research agenda. And we certainly believe in that. But we also are very aware that if you go to most of our First Nations and Métis communities, I can tell you off the top of my head what will be the priorities. And mental health and addictions will be a priority, prevention, diabetes, infectious diseases. So we know that. But we had a case where we went to community partners around a topic that isn't researched at all, very much, and that was First Nations and Métis perceptions of organ donation and transplantation. And that wouldn't have been a priority that the communities would have come up with. But once we introduced the idea of doing research on this, we had huge amount of input and excitement about focusing on this, and we've had significant success. And it's an area where there is no real documentation and publication, a wee bit in Canada and a wee bit in the United States. So we were able to, as a team, we're working with Dr. Michael Moser, who's a surgeon. We were able to identify an area where there's great need for research, but wouldn't be something that generally would come up as a priority. So that's the other thing, is that there's nothing wrong with going to communities and bringing ideas about areas that you're interested in researching. Yeah. So I don't know if there's any questions now.
I have one just from the chat. If you have any tips or suggestions for grad students, like master's or PhD students, who maybe aren't at the stage where they're applying for these larger grants, but how to either become involved in these kinds of projects or to kind of prepare themselves at that stage of their careers, to be well situated for applying for these larger grants.
So I have, yeah, I definitely have some advice, and I'm going to go back to when I was a grad student and how and what happened with me, which was really just happened, and I was so fortunate, and I've tried to provide similar opportunities to any graduate student that I have. And that's that as a graduate student, if you are really serious about research and you're serious about Indigenous health research across the country, we have a number of people who are absolutely skilled in skilled and successful. And so when you're choosing a supervisor, as a graduate student, I would recommend choosing someone who has a robust research program. If you want to become, if you mainly want to do research in the health sciences and that be like a central piece of your career, rather than maybe a lot of teaching, although you always have to do both, right? Um, that you want to find somebody that you can learn from and that can mentor you. And so even if it's the busiest person on the face of the earth. So I had a supervisor, Dr. Margaret Locke. She had 14 PhD students. So you can imagine that I didn't spend a lot of time with her one-on-one. And yet, she was incredibly successful and incredibly busy. And I learned so much from her, and basically being in her group of students. I also then was fortunate to be aligned with Dr. Lawrence Kiermaier, who Margaret referred me over to Lawrence and said he's doing this stuff on Indigenous health, and it turned out that it was one of the original cadre centers. And so I went and worked with Lawrence. And one of the things that Lawrence did for my career is that he took me everywhere he went. So he took me to research meetings. He introduced me to people who were doing research in Indigenous health. Um, he he Greg Brass and myself, put together this large national network. And so I worked as his research coordinator during the time that I was writing my PhD, and we struck a balance in terms of me being able to move forward in that. So learning from him was really, really important, and I was able to benefit from the grants that he had. So what I'm trying to say is try to find a research context that is active and engaged, and and things are happening, right? So with the mentorship network and with our NEAR, these are opportunities for students to get involved, in active research programs, and to learn how do you negotiate all these different things. As far as research funding goes, student funding, it's very, very important that as students that you're trying to apply for the tri-agency funding that's available to students. So even if you're not successful, you have to try. And the reason is because that's how you build your skill set. You build your skill set by swinging for the fence. And I can tell you that sometimes you can predict that, yes, this is something that I know is going to get funded. And then there's times where you think it's going to get funded and it doesn't. And then there's times where you think, no, this isn't going to, and it does. So in all of this, you're not going to get funded if you don't try. So try to apply for as many things as you can apply for. Remember that you don't have to recreate the wheel every time that you write an application. Is that you build upon what you have, and then get examples from other students. So go to students who are successful. So for instance, in Saskatchewan, we have a couple people who were successful Vanier, two Indigenous people, right? Merelda Fiddler and Adam McGinnis, both successful grant writers who have Vaniers. You can always go and talk to them, ask them, and people like to talk about their successes. So don't be shy and go to them and say, how did you do it? You swung for the fence and look at what happened, right? And we have Holly McKenzie, who has a Banting Fellowship, right? And we have other people in our network that have been able to secure funding, who are students. Bobby Henry was successful as a student in terms of receiving funding, and there's other people in our networks who now have gone through and have experience in that. So draw upon the other students for sure in terms of what did they do, and then work closely with your supervisor. Your supervisor's job is to make sure you're successful, right? So anybody who takes on a student, it's their job to support you so that you are successful, right? And so you want to find a supervisor that is willing to make that commitment to you, right? And you have a right to their time, and you have a right to their expertise. And so if that's not working, then maybe you can think about, reconfiguring your committee, right? But I highly encourage people to swing for the fence and to not be shy, to not feel like you're not ready, and having people review your proposal over and over and over again. And when people give feedback, uh, when people give feedback, so if you say that you ask me to review your proposal, if you're a student, chances are that you'll get it back and it will be dripping in red pen and ink. And it's shocking, right? So you get it back and you go, oh my God, like this is awful, right? Like look at what she thinks of me. No, absolutely not. My red pen is not because I'm making a value judgment on you. It's because it's my job to teach you the things that I know, right? So the only way you learn to write is to practice and practice and practice and practice. And grant writing is a skill that it takes years to develop. And so part of the problem I think that we have as people, and I certainly am still this way, I'm incredibly shy about my writing. I grind out writing. It's not natural. So to realize that everybody is like that, and there's a few people that are talented writers that it just comes, like music comes to some people. And so what I want to say is that, if somebody's taking the time to review your proposal, it's because they care about your success and they're trying to give you their best advice. You can at any time take that advice, or you can ignore that advice, right? So you always have the option that if you don't agree with what I have said you should do, you can always ignore it. And as a mentor, my job is to allow you to do that, right? It's up to you, because over the years you have to develop your own judgment about your own kind of rhythm and your own ideas about what will work and what won't work, right? And that's the skills that you're developing over time. So as a student, you're in the position where you have in our network a number of amazing mentors. But you should never think that any of us, if we're giving you feedback, are making a value judgment about you. That is not our job, and it's not our interest to do that. We want to support you, and we want you to be successful. So anything we're giving back to you is advice that we would give ourselves. So if you could see, after, say I've done 10 drafts on a grant, I will take that grant and I will tear it apart, and I will do so there'll be red pen all over my own grant that I've written, and that's just the process. The process is like any grant that I've written, I've probably written 50 drafts of that grant, 50 versions, right? So I go over it, I read it out loud, I go over it over and over again, I go back to the call and say, did I answer the questions properly? So there's all these things that we're doing, and it's not that we just whip them off, not in any way, shape, or form. You should be doing at least 20 to 30 drafts of that grant before you submit it, right? So yeah.
Yeah, Caroline, if I can just jump in there, I just think that, this is Blair, I think it's so true about how much you learn from writing by writing, by sitting down at your desk and working through it. And also then by like sharing drafts back and forth with other people, because you can learn so much about how to reshape things, and taking looks at drafts of proposals, successful proposals that they have done. Also, I wanted to welcome Eric back because he had to step away, but he's back with us. And I think he might have had some questions.
Hi. No specific questions at this moment. I'm not sure what was covered. If you give me a minute or two to kind of recollect my thoughts away from the meeting I was just in to hear. But I'm enjoying the conversation thus far.
If you had any sort of things that you want to share about your sort of own interest in research or your background, that would be welcome too, Eric.
Oh, for sure. Okay. Hello everyone. My name is Eric Mandawi, from the Beaver Lake Cree Nation, Northern Alberta, and currently a third-year medical student at Schulich School of Medicine at Western in London, Ontario. The town hall meeting I was just in had to do with our ever-changing curriculum given the current situation worldwide, and for medical learners, a lot of our clerkship time has been changed significantly. So where it's minute to minute, day to day sort of thing. But for background wise, uh, went to school for medical anthropology at the University of Toronto, uh, graduating 2010. Then a few years later, did a degree in music and studio art at Western University, and now in medical school there. Some of my research background, main interest in land-based approaches to Indigenous health research. I have one co-authored publication at the International Indigenous Policy Journal, through through Chantel Richmond's team at the Indigenous Health Lab there. And yeah, I mean, coming into this workshop, I'm curious to hear what, you know, people's approaches are to grant writing, and with the amount of time that I have now, not that there's much more, but some more because of online learning. Um, there's a few opportunities that have come across my plate uh, for applying for different grants to do health research specifically around COVID and pandemic planning in Indigenous communities. Uh, through, I guess every province has had announcements with new research funding. I was hearing a little earlier about what they're doing in Saskatchewan. But yeah, so I have some writing to do, and I'm glad that I was able to attend uh, this part of the workshop, and look forward to kind of reviewing the half an hour that I missed.
Yeah, I think thanks, Eric, and I thank you for joining. I think that we're having a meeting a little bit later today, basically brainstorming in Saskatchewan here, brainstorming about, what are we going to do? What value can we add to support our communities during this time? And one of our colleagues, Simon Lambert, said, probably in the short term, our value is quite limited, but in the long term, coming out of this, working with our communities to look at what are the things that we need to look at post pandemic, right? And looking back in terms of what happened, and helping our communities to determine, what was learned by the experience, and how can we plan for something, that could easily happen again, right? And so I think we're going to brainstorm today to see, what are the short and long term, contributions that we can make, and how do we best support our communities and moving forward. So we're in a very different climate right now in terms of research, and what the value of research will be, coming out of this situation that we're in, and how can we support, for the improvement of policies and procedures, and generally, how the healthcare system and it ends up working for our people. And I know there's a great deal of concern right now in Saskatchewan about how it is going to work or not work. So
I
oh, go ahead, Allison.
I was just going to say that's a good opportunity for me to plug Simon's talk next week. I can't remember the title off the top of my head, but Dr. Lambert is an experienced researcher around disaster management in Indigenous communities, particularly following the Christchurch earthquake. And so he's going to speak next Thursday at 1 p.m. Saskatchewan time about how past disasters can help to inform our current predicament and planning around that. So certainly everyone on the call is welcome to join us next week. And the link to join the Zoom presentation is on the Mentorship Network website as well, and also on Facebook.
Also, I was just thinking, Eric, as you were talking, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the near centers across the country, but the Alberta Centre is specifically focused around primary health care. It's run by Lindsay Croshoe at the University of Calgary, and he's someone that you might want to connect with at some point. We can certainly connect you with him, and also with our coordinating center for these research centers across the country.
That would be amazing. I'd love having an introduction that way.
Okay. Yeah, we'll send you. Probably Allison will send you email because I'm sure she has your email. Or just pop it in the chat box.
I'll pop it in the chat. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Well, I don't know if there are if there aren't any other questions, maybe we can kind of wrap things up and then continue connecting via email and whatnot from here on out. And then we'll also be uploading the slides and the audio to our website, hopefully in the next week or so I can get that together.